Good afternoon, live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the Mint Special, Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 responses, getting gender equality and women's empowerment right. Hello, I'm your host, Andy Hodges. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 3 p.m. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimbabwe's TV network, or via our Twitter handle, at ZTN News. Monday, the 8th of March 2021 was International Women's Day. We paid tribute to the tremendous efforts made by women in shaping a more equal future and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Globally, women have been on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic in different capacities. For instance, women make up 70% of the workers in the health and social sector globally. Women and girls face specific and often disproportionate economic, health and social risks due to deeply entrenched inequalities, social norms and unequal power relations, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this state of affairs. Evidence from most countries have revealed that the COVID-19 pandemic has not only worsened existing inequalities but also created new gender gaps. Our program today speaks to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls, responses taken to mitigate these impacts, as well as actions needed to support the role of women as agents of change towards a human-centered path to a more equal society in the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Understanding the gender-differentiated impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is fundamental to designing policy responses that reduce vulnerable conditions and strengthen women's agency, placing gender equality at their center. Now, to help us unpack these issues, we have a highly esteemed panel. And joining us in the studio this afternoon is Naomi Chakanya. She's Senior Researcher at the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. And joining us via telephone is Virginia Muwanigwa, Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission. Ladies, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Later on in the program, we will be crossing over to Mrs. Vida Machangwa. She was unable to appear on the show in person. However, we managed to catch up with her and record her this morning. Vida is the Director of Women Affairs and Gender at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprise Development. And later on, we'll hear what she has to say. Naomi, you know, what have been the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, including lockdowns on women and girls? And from an economic perspective, economic development perspective, why does gender parity matter?
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. If we are to talk about the impact of COVID, I think the most affected gender has been the female gender, women and girls. COVID had a negative and huge impact in terms of people's livelihoods. And in Zimbabwe, we have experienced the lockdowns, and those lockdowns have actually limited women's participation in the economy. We know in Zimbabwe, most of the women are engaged in informal economy activities. So once we had the lockdowns, it meant that all the forms and channels of income generation for most women were depleted. And I also hasten to say that even if you look at the sectors, economic sectors, we have sectors that have been largely impacted by COVID. And you find that those sectors are the same sectors where you have overrepresentation of female workers. We are talking about the health sector. The 2019 Labour Force Survey indicated that around 62% of all the labour force in the formal sector are women. If you look even at the teaching sector, the education sector, 61% are women. If you look at those that deal with accommodation and related services, it's 62%. So you find that because these sectors have been negatively impacted, it also made that was a domino effect even on the women that participate in those economies.
That's an interesting point, because you have the informal sector, which is mostly women, you have the teaching sector, mostly women, you have the frontline staff, the nurses, which are mostly women. So you're right, the COVID-19 impact had a disproportionate effect on women in general.
Yeah, true.
We're now joined by Virginia Muwanigwa. She's Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission. Virginia, welcome to the Mint Special again. Now, Virginia, Section 246 of the Constitution mandates the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, ZGC, to monitor issues concerning gender equality in the country. So your comments on the progress the country has made towards ensuring gender equality and some of the challenges mitigating against gender equality in light of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much. And definitely the Zimbabwe Gender Commission has a mandate under the Constitution that revolves around monitoring, protecting, promoting and advancing gender equality as provided for in the Constitution. And in terms of, I think the greatest progress or the greatest success we've had as a country is that we have a relatively strong legislative framework. That is to say that our Constitution clearly upholds gender equality and non-discrimination. And even we have a lot of laws that have been adopted, albeit post-actively, to address some of the key issues of gender inequalities that the women and the girls of Zimbabwe face. And even as we are now looking at COVID-19, we actually see, as Naomi has already said, that the COVID-19 has amplified the inequalities among the men, women, boys, and girls of Zimbabwe. But it has also meant that beyond just the inequalities, there are some sections that are more vulnerable than others. So we have a good legislative framework for which advocacy for ensuring that there is equality among women and men in practice can happen. And we do have some measures that have been adopted. Like if you're looking at the issue of the economy, I know that in our country we have adopted what is called gender-responsive budgeting. And I start with gender-responsive budgeting because we are speaking from an economic perspective. And what basically gender-responsive budgeting is supposed to do is to ensure that all ministries across the different ministries are supposed to then be clear what are the specific needs of the men, the women, the boys and the girls within the ambit of their work. And then to also ensure that as they're doing their programming, they are ensuring that the programming does not magnify the vulnerability of the groups that they work with, but it addresses their specific concerns. So you find that we do have, in principle, very good framework. We do have, in principle, we have adopted good policies. The challenge comes in that the implementation has not matched the policies.
Virginia, I want to touch on that because here I'm talking about progress. You know, there's been a lot of lip service, and let me call it that, towards gender equality. I think in every budget, every speech that we've heard, people have talked about that. But really on the ground, it appears that not a lot has really moved over the last few years. Your comment on that?
You know, if you're speaking to me as somebody from the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, obviously, when we look at it, we'll be saying that not enough has been done because we are guided by the constitutional benchmarks, which say that we need to be ensuring that there is equality in practice. So there is work in progress. Yes, the ministries are addressing gender equality. They do speak to gender equality. But in terms of practice, in terms of the outcomes, like at the end of the year when we are saying to what extent have we addressed the specific needs of men or women, we still have a lot of work to go.
Yes, I think so, yeah. Naomi, the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly affected the world of work. I think you spoke about the loss of incomes and loss of jobs, particularly for women. And of course, it's cost huge on the economies, of course, because women obviously contribute a lot to the economic well-being of the country. Millions of female workers, especially those the lower echelons of the labour market, are holding precarious jobs or, as you said, the informal sector paying disproportionate brunt. Now, social protection has become essential in supporting job and income security for those affected. But how effective have been our social protection measures here in Zimbabwe? And how can they be strengthened to make them more effective?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. Before COVID, Zimbabwe as a country, we haven't been doing much in terms of social protection. Yes, there have been measures, but they have not been adequate to address the needs that have risen over the years because of the economic decline, which has demanded more social protection from the government to provide to its citizens. So yes, indeed, if you look at unpaid care work, for example, we have women who are participating in the economy, but we also have those same women that are supposed to care for the family. And when the government doesn't provide enough resources for these women, resources in terms of provision of water and services, resources in terms of better health, resources even in terms of incentives to allow more girls to be in education. It basically means that we are doing a disservice to women. So our social protection, we have a very good social protection policy, but that has not been complemented by budgetary support, financial support, to ensure that the good intentions in that policy are translated to real development in the lives of women. And if you are looking at the informal economy, for years we have been doing advocacy around formalization of the informal economy, because women are overrepresented. But the progress with this formalization is taking so much time, and yet, these challenges are growing day by day for women. So you find that we still have a lot to do in terms of providing social protection for women who are operating in the informal economy, through even providing decent working spaces. It's part of social protection. But you find that those issues, we are still battling with them, we are still struggling with them as a country. Even if you look at, let me just add, even if you look, there's a question you asked first in the beginning, even if you look at issues to do with GBV, which has been on the rise, it has also been found in the labor market.
In fact, I'm going to ask you about GBV later on in the show, because I'd like to answer that separately, because it's very important. That's right. Virginia, I want to ask you about social protection, because we will later on hopefully hear from the ministry. I did ask Vida the question later, but the issue that I'm trying to understand is, commentators are saying that social protection, Zimbabwe's social protection network, or net, covers everybody. It's talking about the vulnerable in society. It doesn't seem to be gender specific, so to speak. If you're vulnerable, you can go and get social protection. What would be your comment to that? I mean, it isn't gender specific, is it, the social protection in the country?
No, in principle, it is gender specific. I think we were moving around with people from the Ministry of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare, and they do segment the responses in terms. It's just that I think we cannot pretend that we have adequate resources to be able to address all the demands that are there, and that were also amplified by the COVID-19. So you'll find that even if in principle, even in terms of our policies, even in terms of our programming, we have planned to ensure that we reach everyone. The resources may just not be enough. So because of that, you then find that those people that were vulnerable become even more vulnerable, because they have been promised something, but they're actually not able to access it. But having said that, in principle, we are okay. There are some issues that I want to raise in practice where we need to improve, because last year, again, some of the issues that came out in terms of delivering the money to those vulnerable groups, it was said that they would have the money sent to their numbers, to their cell numbers, via EcoCash. And what that already assumes is that these vulnerable people have a phone, and they're also on the EcoCash or whatever other money transfer system that they are on. And it's not always the case. And it also does not adequately take into consideration the power dynamics, that I could actually have access to a cell phone and also an EcoCash line, but this is not under my control, especially if I'm in a marriage. It's actually under the control of the men. So,
but and even the amount, though. I mean, there was criticism about the amount. I believe it started off at $300. It moved to $800. They're now talking $1,500. I mean, $300 can buy you what in Zimbabwe?
That speaks to the issue I raised earlier, to say that our resources are not matching the need on the ground. And so you then get to a point where you're coming up with programs that do not necessarily make a dent in the poverty that we want to address.
Thank you. You're watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 responses, getting gender equality and women's empowerment right. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 3 p.m. Naomi, before I move on, I saw you wanted to make a quick comment there, please.
I just wanted to add on to say our budgetary support, because we need to substantiate our statements with figures. If you look even at the allocation, international benchmarks say social protection should receive around 4.5% of any country's GDP. But if you look at our country in 2020, the government only provided about 0.7%. In 2021, our social protection was only 0.2% of our GDP. So we are actually going down. So that actually gives you a scenario to say that we are not doing much in terms of progression around,
Well, an additional 4% of the budget should be going towards
even
social
water
protection.
and services, 1.5% of any national GDP should go towards water. But for us in Zimbabwe, we've been hovering around 0.2%. So you already see that these deficits that we have are emanating mostly because of the lack of adequate support.
This is the key, isn't it? Social protection doesn't mean me doling out money to you every month. It is about health services, water services, etc. Things that really matter in citizens' lives. I think people always think social protection should be just money. It isn't.
No.
It's actually the government
it's about
putting together the
investment in infrastructure that provides or that uplifts the livelihood of women.
Right.
Even if we look at the COVID-19 safety nets, around 1,500, look at what has happened to our poverty datum lines. We look at what has happened to our food poverty lines. So we are saying the government is providing 1,500 per month, and yet the food alone
for one
is
person,
costing,
it's what, 7,500 if I'm around there?
I'll talk about a family of 5 which Zimstat uses. Currently, by February 2021, food alone, the food poverty line, was around 20,000 for a family of 5. And the poverty datum line is around 26,000 now as we speak, Zimbabwean dollars. And yet we are still at 1.5.
Yeah.
So that huge gap really needs to be addressed.
Because we don't have the resources. I think that must be the honest.
That has to be contested.
That can be contested. Yes, please. Yes, please.
The issue of not having adequate resources.
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Because from a gender equality perspective, you may not have adequate resources, but even with inadequate resources, you still prioritize your most important groups or your most important needs. So for us in Zimbabwe, we need to then be clear what is it we are prioritizing, even as we recognize that we don't have adequate resources. Exactly. Are we prioritizing the lives of the men and the women, the boys and the girls that are vulnerable? Because again, the human resources are what's most important.
Right,
are we
that's a very good point.
Providing through our public service delivery system, providing the health care, the education, whether it's the access to justice through the relevant institutions, so that then our people do not have to be looking for additional resources to access things they are supposed to access through the public service delivery mechanism.
Nice. Virginia, you can comment on that, come to Naomi. Virginia, I want to move on to something which Naomi had raised earlier, and of course that's the issue of gender-based violence, because it's been reported that Zimbabwe witnessed a spike in gender-based violence, including forced marriages, child labor, and adolescent marriages during the COVID-19 pandemic. This, of course, was attributed to rising socio-economic pressures, increased tensions in homes and communities, and school closures, all induced, of course, as a result of the pandemic-related poverty in some cases. Now, some of the survivors are even resorting to the drastic measure of withdrawing their complaints owing to economic dependency on abusive partners. So what have you been doing to address this as a commission? And how, in your opinion, can we put an end or try to put an end to this scourge of gender-based violence?
Yes. So gender-based violence is one of those areas, of course, where we monitor, as we are monitoring the extent to which gender equality and non-discrimination is being realized in practice. So, and one way of knowing that we don't have equality is just the amount of gender-based violence. And then gender-based violence is specific in that it's the kind of violence that happens because you are a man or a woman. And so the power dynamics are what's at play. So one finds that because of the inequalities that are already in our society, gender-based violence has had more women being the victims or the survivors or the targets than men. and more men have been the perpetrators. This is information that comes out of those whose day-to-day work is to monitor gender-based violence. So as an institution, as a constitutional human rights institution, we've also been working with stakeholders to not only directly respond to specific gender-based violence cases, because one of our mandates is to receive complaints and then to actually deal with these complaints as we see fit. So this is something that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then apart from that, we also do advocacy. So working with different stakeholders, whether it's Parliament of Zimbabwe, whether it's the Ministry of Women Affairs, the different ministries, the education institutions, depending on the different types of gender-based violence, to ensure that we prevent or we have the kind of environment that does not facilitate gender-based violence. So we have been doing a lot of advocacy, particularly around the issue of sexual harassment, because this is one of the biggest forms, although it's not as well recorded because it's not easy to report it or to monitor it, but it has come out as one of the issues facing our female, although it also affects men, but facing mainly the female citizens of Zimbabwe, especially in tertiary institutions. We've also been looking at just gender-based violence from the issue of early child marriages, and I'm sure you've seen the latest report by the Minister of Women Affairs Community and SMEs Development to Parliament of Zimbabwe, where she was sharing unbelievable statistics about the number of teenage pregnancies that have happened just from the beginning of the year to date, looking at about 4,000 or just under 5,000 teenage pregnancies across the country, and having National and Central topping that with 4,500 children falling pregnant. And also having more than, I think it's about 1,700 something of our children being married off in the same period, of which 1,500 or thereabouts have come from National and Central. So this tells you that the gender-based violence is not just something that occurs in and of itself. It is linked to inherent socio-economic, cultural, religious, and other beliefs that actually ensure that the women and the children and the girls cannot recognize their constitutional rights to personal security and bodily integrity.
Naomi, you know, those statistics, teenage pregnancies, 4,500 just in a very short period of time. Yeah. Child labor, of course, we see a lot of women, girls on the streets vending or even begging in some cases during the lockdown. Forced marriages, teenage marriages, and of course the increase in gender-based violence across the board in Zimbabwe. Your comment?
It's very true. Those statistics are a true reflection of what is happening on the ground. And I think we haven't been doing much. I think we really need to increase our level of awareness and also address the justice system in Zimbabwe. Because even if a woman has been violated, if you look at the costs that have to be paid to seek justice around any type of violence for women, you find that the costs have increased tremendously during the course of this COVID-19 period. So it means that most women are not able to, access justice. So they would rather sit at home, whilst at the same time they give the perpetrators more room to continue to violate them. So I think even our justice system really needs to be revamped in how we are addressing issues of costs, issues of delivery of the justice system. And you were talking about inequality. There's a question you asked me in the beginning: why is gender equality so important? Now we have more girls out of school. What does it mean for their future? It means that even they might not be able to go back to school, and that means that the government has to really put in place practical measures to ensure that those that have been affected, the girls, still continue to engage in their schooling activities. Although the legal framework is there, but the practicality, I think there's really need to work around it. Even when we look around issues to do with those girls that are falling into these negative situations, do you think that those girls will really be economically empowered in the future because they've lost their opportunities to further their education? So it is a cause of worry. And let's also look at the geographical. Virginia is really mentioned stacking, geographical, differences around this, the geographical impact, Mashonal and Central. So even when the programs are being targeted, they also have to really look at what are the causes. Why do we have a spike of early childhood, early girls' pregnancy in a particular province, for example, and how should we address it? And I think these statistics give, enough tools for our government to really recommit itself around issues of GBV.
I want to ask you this, because earlier on you did talk about the representation of women, particularly in the informal and vulnerable employment. You talked about 62 or so percentage in the informal sector. And of course, they contribute to family work. You talked about unpaid work, which is about 4.5 hours a day as compared to men. I believe it's about 2.7 hours. How can we ensure the dignity and safety of women, and I suppose to a certain degree men, in the world of work, particularly in the informal sector?
Okay, thank you. I've said earlier on that we have been talking about the formalization strategy, but I don't think much is being done. Whatever progress is in place, I think it needs to be fast-tracked. Virginia was talking more about priorities, and I think this is one of the major priorities if we are to address the informal economy. And when we are saying formalization, we are not just talking about taxing those that are doing the informal activities. We are talking about supporting them to ensure that their businesses grow, supporting them to ensure that they have decent working space to preserve their dignity. We have seen how women and men, of course, who are in informal economy, how they've been mistreated by law enforcement agencies. And, some of these, there is room and scope to dialogue around these issues, but I don't think much attention has been really placed around that. So, formalization is required, but we're also saying that even when resources are being given, we heard that during COVID-19, there were resources targeted at informal economy players, associations, even those who are in the informal economy. We have been speaking to some of them, and they've been saying that, if some have received their members, it's just a small number that have received these COVID-19 social safety nets. And countries across, even in SADC, they've been really putting in, resources to support this informal economy.
Ministry, and in fact, we had someone on our show recently, I think it was last week, and they said 23,000 women had been helped through this network. And then when we asked, has anyone been helped, no one could really answer
exactly.
who.
We always find those, contestations. And maybe there is need for those that give those statistics to be more clearer when they say we are giving 23,000 women. And even we need to interrogate further to say, what is being given to those 23,000? Is it meaningful? Does it make any meaningful impact? I think it would be better to even reduce your number, but make sure that those people that you have given that money or whatever support changes their lives, not for them to continue having this begging mentality. We need production. We need these women to be more productive in whatever that they do. And I think we really need more research and more, service provision in that area.
It appears that we have lost Virginia Muanigwa. She was on the line. We will try and get her back, because it's a very important debate, and I wanted to ask her a few more questions. But you're watching the Mint Special, Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, COVID-19 responses, getting gender equality and women's empowerment right. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Please also tune into Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 3 p.m. Now, as I said at the top of the show, we had managed to speak to Mrs. Vida Machangwa. She was unable to make it to the program, unfortunately, but she is the Director of Women's Affairs and Gender at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Women's Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprises. And let's just go through what she had to say. So I asked her firstly, of course, to what extent has government policy responses to counter the impacts of COVID-19 incorporated a gender perspective? What policy responses has the government put in place to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls. This is what you had to say.
I would like to say to a great extent, the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe, like any other country, has taken drastic measures to contain the deadly pandemic. Although some of the measures taken, such as lockdowns and curfews, really affected the informal sector where the majority of women are employed. Further, the lockdown restrictions imposed by government in order to contain the spread of the virus increased the burden of care on women and girls. In addition, experience of domestic violence, there's also high schools were locked down, and with the anxiety of lost economic opportunities, this has increased the occurrence of domestic violence. I would like, in response to the question, to say that, however, government set up a task force comprising ministries with specialized capacities in providing preventative and curative services. The task force was the supreme coordinating body which works with relevant committee of officials from all ministries. The Ministry of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprises Development sits on the committee of officials responsible for the provision of social services and poverty. And it is through this committee that the ministry profiled advice on gender mainstreaming to support the sector under its mandate. And this has resulted in the following initiatives being implemented. The first one, as we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and these were the measures that were taken. The first one, classification of gender-based services under essential services category. The ministry also, bearing in mind the increase in domestic violence and the survivors of domestic survivors across the country, it has some one-stop centers and shelters that are dotted around the country. So the ministry, through its like UNFPA, it also distributed dignity kits to survivors of gender-based violence. We also had, working with various partners, we provided shuttle services for survivors of gender-based violence during the lockdown and access services. We know that in terms of movement, this was during the lockdown. Therefore, the ministry also provided shuttle services for survivors of gender-based violence. Thank you very much. I would like to say that as I mentioned earlier on, the government has put in place measures to mitigate the impact of COVID pandemic on women and girls. In terms of gender-based violence, as I alluded to, the government continues to offer services through its one-stop centers.
Protection services for women, what specifically the government's put in place for social protection?
Support to start up income generating projects, especially to our SMEs who are the majority of the informal sector. So funding by the ministry was availed through our Zimbabwe Women Microfinance Bank. We also have the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Corporation, SMEDCO, and then we also have the Women Development Fund, which is a fund that specifically targets women. We also have, under the ministry, the Zimbabwe Community Development Fund, which is also basically for communities, including men and also women. And of course, the ministry works with various partners, such as OFID funds. We also have the AFBD, Youth and Women Empowerment Program. So in terms of cushioning women I think that is what we have. And in terms of social protection measures that the government has put in place, this includes the seed capital grants for small and medium enterprises to recover. We also have soft loan schemes aimed at financing entrepreneurial initiatives. We also have SACCOs, and they've also come a key and cost-effective financial tool also to fund our women entrepreneurs.
I think the issue as well came in about gender-based violence and also what the ministry believes needs to be done going forward in terms of making gender-based rights and a reality on the ground, because the legal framework is there. The question is, as my guests have said earlier, implementation.
The rule of rights, gender equality notions, and specific and elaborate rights for women. We also have the National Gender Policy, which provides which is a guiding framework in gender in all the sectors of the economy. We have also even developed a gender mainstreaming guideline for our 9 ministries so that the issue of gender mainstreaming is incorporated in all government entities.
All right, so that was Mrs. Vida Machangwa. Unfortunately, she did really want to be on the show because she did tell me on the phone it was very important, this discussion, and she did send her apologies. She is the Director of Women's Affairs and Gender at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprise Development. I must be honest, it's a pity we didn't have the full interview, Naomi, but it was an interesting interview in terms of going forward, because one of the questions, of course, was that there's strong legislation. We have it in Zimbabwe. We have a constitution and so forth. And she highlighted the fact that it's about implementation on the ground. And the question was that how can we make implementation better? Maybe if I come to them, let me bring Virginia in there. Virginia, you heard what I was saying there. Great laws, great policies, even in our constitution. But on the ground implementation, I think you alluded to it earlier.
Yes. One thing that she did not mention is that we have a very good gender machinery, national gender machinery, and which gender machinery includes not only the ministry but also the formation of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, whose role is to now try and follow up on the extent to which all those principles, all those policies are being implemented. And this is what we do, speaking to the different ministries, trying to ensure that not only the planning process, but also the evaluation process can show that we have gender equality, that we are addressing the specific needs of the women and men of Zimbabwe equally. So it's still a challenge in that. If you go into the different institutions, and I'm going to share some statistics now inspired by Naomi, that in February 2017, as a commission, we carried out a baseline survey on the gender composition of staff in government institutions, ministries, departments, and agencies as part of our monitoring services. We noted during that survey that 68% of senior management staff in all government ministries are men, while women are 32%. Also established that in parastatals, 79% of chief executive officers are men, and women are the rest of it, the 21%. Managerial positions in parastatals, again, men were at 74%. And then gender composition of board members under various ministries were no different, as men constituted 65%. What this basically means is, yes, we can have very good principles, very good policies, but it also then goes down to the political will and ability to translate those policies into your day-to-day work. And this is where we need to strengthen our work.
I mean, Naomi, you heard there, I mean, it seems very difficult for women to break what I would call the imaginary glass ceiling, but it's really there, isn't it? So maybe you could comment on that, but I want you to also comment on this, because it's been shown that sufficient investments in 5 areas. Now, these areas are education, family planning, maternal mortality, digital inclusion, and unpaid care work. They can go a long way, Naomi, in getting gender equality right. Well, this is what commentators state. So how do you believe that these investments can be financed? Because it seems to boil down at some point to resources that that country has to put these plans in action.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with commenting what Virginia mentioned, and thank you, Virginia, for sharing that those enlightening statistics. I was part of that process, and you were mentioning very true that women are few in terms of, their positions within various state machineries. But looking even at where the women are found, you'd find that even if you say 32% are holding, positions within a particular ministry, you find that those 32%, the majority, 90%, are not even in the decision-making levels. They are at the lower echelons where they cannot make decisions, but rather just implement what they are given from the top.
Like accountants. And,
yes.
There's great jobs.
So it makes it very difficult then if we are saying that we are giving women space, but at what level are you giving them the space? So it's also an area that I think our government really needs to work on in terms of facilitating and putting even affirmative action programs, new ones that resonate with the emerging challenges that we have. So I just wanted to also add
that's a good point. And this issue about financing, those are such serious areas, aren't they? Education, family planning, maternal mortality, digital inclusion, unpaid care work.
Yeah. Yes, I said earlier on that the issue of financing is a contested.
Yes, it is.
It's a contested issue. Indeed, Virginia mentioned it's about prioritization. And you find that these key areas that you have mentioned, these are enablers to development. Now we're talking about digitalizing and how many women are participating in this digital economy. The majority of our women in Zimbabwe are in the rural areas. And can you really expect them to be effectively participating when the infrastructure itself is not even found to participate in the digital economy? In the rural and also in the urban. So the issue about financing, what we always advocated, Ledriz, is that what we need more is reprioritization of our expenditures. Reprioritization of our expenditures, number one. Number two, it's also about dealing with a lot of resources that are, that are finding themselves out of the system through corruption,
through the back door, so to speak.
Through illicit financial flows.
Yeah.
And, even our statistics, even our national budgets, even our development plans, they say that corruption is weighing down progress in terms of delivery of progress in human, welfare in Zimbabwe. Our own documents are saying
is what, $100 million US a month, apparently.
Yeah. So, but we are not seeing much action around that area. I was reading literature and I'm finding that some other countries, what they are doing is that they are vigorous and aggressive in dealing with corruption. Whatever resources that they find or that they get or recover, yes, whatever finance that they recover, they ring-fence those resources and invest in infrastructure that everyone can see. Yeah. That, this is the 50 billion we recovered from this particular activity. Let us build a clinic in a rural area, for example. Let us build a school out of this, so that we have, pointers to say, we are doing a lot in terms of corruption. We need to be serious around.
We need to be serious about it. Let me bring Virginia into the. It's the same question, Virginia. You heard Naomi there about corruption, about stamping down the corruption, using the money from illicit financial flows to fund social protection programs, but also spending education, family planning, maternal mortality. She talked digital inclusion, of course, how people in rural areas and even in urban areas don't have access to digital, and also the cost of it as well. So your comments on the financing side, Virginia?
Definitely the financing needs to be, as a country, when we look at our constitution and when we also look at the statements, listen to the statements, we have said that we prioritize or we believe in gender equality. And what this means is that even when it comes to financing, this should be seen. So we need to be able to start seeing the diversity in terms of those who sit and decide how to allocate finances, both in terms of voice, in terms of the choices we make as a country, in terms of the questions we ask ourselves, in terms of what results are we looking for, what results are we looking for, in terms of how we do our problem analysis, because the financing follows a problem analysis. So if the issue does not come up during analysis of specific problems that need to be addressed, you can be sure that we are not necessarily going to allocate resources to something that has not been identified.
Now, Virginia, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our show, and you can see we actually could continue carrying on because this is such a vital topic. But let me ask you this, and I have to ask you to be brief. In your opinion, what actions must be taken to support the role of women as agents of change towards a human-centered plan to a more equal society in the COVID-19 pandemic era and beyond?
So the first action is just to ensure that we have diversity. So we need to reach out and ensure that the voices of the women are amplified. We need to also be able to hear their choices. And to also, as we do our results-based budgeting, program-based budgeting as government, ensure that that also includes the issues of gender equality and women empowerment.
Right.
But more importantly, as we also review progress, we need to be asking ourselves, what is our definition of progress? Who is saying that we've done very well? Who is actually saying we have achieved something? Are the women's voices also included there? And I like also, finally, just the recommendation by Naomi to say, as we are also dealing with gender and corruption, because as Gender Commission, this is an area we are also involved in working with different stakeholders. We need to be able to not just highlight where there have been areas of corruption, but the gender dimension of corruption, in that not only do women then go without necessary public service because of of corruption, but they actually carry an unfair burden of corruption. So I like the proposal that once we have actually gotten some money through our activities as a government, we need to then go back to those areas that were actually affected by the corruption in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginia. Naomi, final word. Way forward, how do we make this gender, the human-centered path to a more equal society?
Okay, thank you. Quickly, I want to add on to what Virginia has also said, that number one, we've talked about resources. Reprioritization is very important. We've also talked about affirmative action, not only in the economic field, but in all spheres of the economy. Where are the women? Where are the voices of the women? We find that whilst the policy is there, whilst the legislation is there, but in terms of practicality, I think we are still lagging behind. And we also need to deal with the issue of patriarchy. We cannot go on and say, make progress around gender equality when we don't deal with patriarchy at home, in society, in the economic field, in the political field. I think we really need to have a serious discussion around how do we give women safe spaces, because at times when women voice out, they are being quickly, cut off because they have said what affects them, and it's not, comfortable with the other gender in most cases. So it's very important to have, those serious discussions around how do we deal with patriarchy in our own systems. And let me also say that going forward, we have very good policies, but we are lagging behind in terms of our macroeconomic policies. Our macroeconomic, like for example, the National Development Strategy, it has got a good results framework, but nowhere do we find any gender indicator for us to monitor. There are all other indicators, but no gender. How many women are going to benefit from this strategy? How many men are going to benefit? So how do we monitor we are going forward or we are going backwards? And how do we correct ourselves when we don't put in place targeted indicators? So I think we really need to, especially with NDS, my passion is on NDS. Yes. We really need, because it's going to shape our next 5 years of implementation. And we really need serious, and we should not forget women's organizations. They are there and they've got very good inputs. But sometimes, it ends with consultation. But when it comes to rolling out of the activities, they are sidelined. So we really need to work around that.
I think on that note, we have come to the end of a very interesting program this afternoon. You have been watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama, our discussion, COVID-19 responses, getting gender equality and women's empowerment right. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz. Now, don't miss Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 3 p.m. I'd like to thank our guests today, Naomi Chakanya, Senior Researcher at the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz; Virginia Muanigwa, she's Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission; and Mrs. Vaida Machangwa, Director of Women Affairs and Gender at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Women Affairs, Community, Small and Medium Enterprise Development. Ladies, thank you very much for appearing on a very vibrant show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
A final comment. According to the ILO, the employment loss for women stands at 5% in 2020 versus 3.9% for men. Women have been more likely than men to drop out of the labour force and become inactive during this crisis. Lower paid workers, many of whom are women, have been severely affected. Those in lower skilled occupations lost more working hours than higher paying managerial and professional jobs. Women have also borne a heavy burden of unpaid care work. Women spend twice as many hours on household work than men. Women spend an average of 20.2 hours per week cleaning the house, washing clothes, cooking and shopping for the family care and childcare, whereas men spend only 10.7 hours. In many countries, women's health has been adversely impacted by the reallocation of resources and priorities away from crucial areas such as sexual and reproductive health services. This could lead to an increase in maternal mortality and morbidity, adolescent pregnancies, and HIV and sexually transmitted diseases. Given regressive gender trends observed over the course of the COVID-19 crisis and uneven progress towards gender equality even before the crisis, governments and other key stakeholders can make a vital contribution to promote gender equality through inclusive policy making as well as gender inclusive representation in leadership and decision making. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the government should fully fund programs that reduce gender inequalities, violence against women and girls, and prevention and response programs. I'm Andy Hodges, and that's it for me. Have a great weekend. Goodbye, and you all be safe.